My name is Janet at Buckingham, and I'm a board member of Cardus. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to this dialogue between government leaders and leaders of faith communities. A warm welcome to Minister Thibodeau, Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, to Will Boma, Parliamentary Assistant to the Premier, and to MPP Sam Oosterhoff. Thank you so much for taking the time for this today. Cardus has a strong interest in the role and value of religion in society. It has been conducting and publishing research on this subject for many years. Cardus also values dialogue between leaders of various sectors as key to its mission of social renewal and flourishing. I wish you a very constructive discussion today. At that, I will turn things over to Ray Pennings, Executive Vice President of Cardus, who will moderate the conversation. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Janet, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome our three guests today, as well as over 150 faith leaders from across the province who have registered to join us. We're excited for this opportunity to have a conversation, as Janet said, between civic leaders and faith leaders, as an expression of Cardus's belief that the flourishing of society requires dialogue and constructive support between the leaders of various spheres in society. This particular discussion arises out of a letter that I was asked to co-sign. It was a letter that 12 other faith leaders, including Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh, as well as various branches of the Christian faith, sent to Premier Ford on February the 8th. In consequence of that letter, various conversations were held. We raised in that letter two issues. First, the current restrictions on religious gatherings and our desire to see a transition to them so that faith communities could continue to meet and carry out their obligations. And secondly, to start a dialogue to see how faith communities might be of assistance to the government in the vaccine distribution and in other social needs that have arisen from the pandemic. In the first half of this webinar, I'm going to explore these questions with my three guests. Now, I understand they are all elected officials. And in our political system, there is such a thing as party discipline and message consistency. And so it's important that we acknowledge the fact that our guests may not be able to say everything publicly that they think privately. That said, I would welcome them to use this forum to make an announcement of the sort that faith leaders are looking for. However, you do need to know that we do understand the constraints and respect the constraints that are on you as you participate, and we want to thank you for your willingness to do so nonetheless. However, we can be respectful and still press them on issues of concern. In preparation for this webinar, I have consulted with and summarized the input of several faith leaders, and I'll be raising some of their questions as well. And during the second half of this webinar, those of you who are online will have your chance. Put your questions in the Q&A box. My Cardus colleagues are monitoring that box, and they will pose your questions, or assuming that some of you will have similar questions, they'll summarize the overlap of them, give them to me, and I will pose them to our panelists in the second part of the presentation. Now, I do not see, is Minister Thibodeau not joining us yet? Okay,
my understanding is
he's in
this process of signing on.
He is in the process of signing on. Well, let me then start with MPPs Bauma and Oosterhoff. Let me just to get the ball rolling. I know that there has been a lot of discussion in the media and also in faith communities, a concern usually summarized by some variation of the cure is worse than the disease. There is a lot of concern that the spiritual needs of people have been sort of taking second place to the physical needs in all of this. I just want to give you right up at the opening here an opportunity to address that concern and how you have heard it and how you respond when it is brought to you. Perhaps we can start with you, MPP Bauma.
Thanks, Ray. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Good. No. So I think that's a I guess that it all depends on how you view this issue. And the different responses to it. And I would say that I have had just as many faith leaders reach what we're doing is on the right track and keep it up. What is our role in it? So I guess I will just start with the conviction that I've been given very, very strongly, which is, for many people that I meet in this job is I will be as close as they ever come to meeting Jesus Christ, and as a Christian. And my job then is to represent Christ to the best of my ability. And in a post, exactly does that look like? How can I show the best? And we can speak about freedom, and we can spout all those things, how to exemplify the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ to those that I interact with, and how I choose to do that and to submit. When I look at my biblical examples of God followers, Christ followers through the ages, and how they've served in pagan environments, I don't see strong examples of people calling for their rights more than I see people just obediently serving where they've been placed. And I know we've had lengthy discussions, Ray, about Daniel's role in that in Babylon, and how Paul comported himself in Roman culture, and if you think about Joseph in the courts of Pharaoh, and even someone like Obadiah serving King Ahab, you have a very strong examples of people serving faithfully in pagan courts, and not so much getting caught up in rights as in serving faithfully. And I think as Christians in a culture then, and from my experience, I think example of COVID and the restrictions placed upon churches that I think we are still in a place where we can preach the gospel and we would like it to be. And I haven't seen strong convincing arguments that would say that our rights are being infringed upon to an excessive pattern by what I see in Ontario.
Okay,
so that'd be my first out of the gate. Sorry, just jumping in late and
MPP,
getting into that.
Welcome, Minister Thibodeau. Welcome. Glad you're able to join us. Let me just transition for a moment to MPP Oosterhoff. What are you hearing, and how are you responding to these concerns?
Yeah, so absolutely hear variations of that concern expressed, and often I question, how bad do you want the disease to be before you want to see any cure? And I guess that's being a little cute, but what I mean by that is there needs to be a balance and response to the very real effects, not only of COVID as its particular disease on people, but also the impact that it has on the rest of society, whether that's our healthcare capacity and the ability to ensure that there's provision of other care that is obviously impacted by the necessity of caring for those with COVID. And so my response often is expressing the need for balance. And that's something I speak about a great deal. Let's take the example of restrictions or lockdowns, as people call them more broadly. Last October, the NDP was calling for lockdowns. The Liberals were calling for lockdowns. To this day, as we move into less restrictive zones in most of the province, they are calling for lockdowns and saying that we are being foolhardy by lifting the restrictions that we have in place. But as the Premier has talked about, the reality is we need to recognize the different needs that are in society, and we can't be reductionistic or minimalistic, and we have to take a balanced approach. And so when it comes to places of worship, recognizing that Ontario has 30%, which is the highest percentage of any jurisdiction in Canada, any province, any territory, that's also because of a recognition throughout government that places of worship have value, they matter, and we need to do what we can to ensure that they're kept open for a wide variety of reasons, but also recognizing the fact that those partnerships that are so key in places of worship in society are so much driven also by worship services, but beyond that. Let's look at the history very quickly of Places of worship engaged in hospitals, engaged in social services, children aid societies, mental health supports, which I know Minister Tobolo will talk about, providing supports for those with addictions. These are all driven by, initially at least, by places of faith, and we need to recognize that as well.
Great. Well, let's transition to that. Minister Tobolo, your portfolio is mental health and addictions. And faith leaders are certainly not the only ones to have highlighted that in addition to the public health issues that have been brought on by the virus pandemic, there are consequences for a lockdown, whether it's mental health, emotional health, spiritual health. Can you describe for us a little bit of the process that you as a government have been going through, weighing the risks in our healthcare system and dealing with COVID directly as a physical health disease, and all of the other consequences manifested? And I know you've spoken out with concern about opioids and suicides and some of the other things that are coming out. How do you go through that balancing act? Maybe you can share with us a little bit about that.
Sure, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I apologize for being late as well. I was stuck in another meeting and I tried my best to get out. I'd like to answer that question by premising it with where we are with mental health and addictions in the province of Ontario. I've often said it, before the pandemic hit us and mental health was seen as an issue of grave concern to the people of the province. We had a pandemic in mental health in this province long before COVID-19. And our government recognized that, and our premier recognized that. And it's the reason why we have now a minister responsible for mental health and addictions, and looking at the underlying reasons why the problems exist, whether it be mental health or addiction, and looking at finding solutions to those problems by looking at the social determinants of health and taking a multi-ministerial approach to finding solutions to the problems. So when we talk about mental health, and what needs to be done, we utilize not a medical model or utilizing hospitals as a way of resolving the problems, but we need to look at this from a biopsychosocial, spiritual way. And what that means is understanding the underlying issues that are bringing about or creating the mental health issues or the addiction issues. So from our standpoint, when we created the roadmap to wellness, it was created almost to the day, to a year to today, the actual roadmap, and COVID hit. And it forced us to look not at changing what our philosophy was, which is to create that integrated, client-centered, structured approach, but change to how do we deliver services in a time when we can't have the people together, whether it be in a room or in a group. Now, when we talk about places of worship, to me, mental health takes place in community. It takes place in the classroom. It takes place in a church or a place of worship. And by that, I mean that a lot of us rely on each other and the communications that come as a result of being in settings that we consider congregate settings today because of what we're dealing with the pandemic. So from the standpoint of delivering services and ensuring that people have the environment necessary to heal, we need to look at all the different aspects of that individual's life, not just the medical model or limiting it to biology. So again, from a spiritual standpoint, I think it's extremely important that we provide those opportunities to reinforce, because the healing, the results are going to come from inside the person, not from outside.
Yeah. Let me just segue from that a little bit. In requesting you to participate in this, our desire was not just so much to figure out where we've come from, but sort of to help faith leaders imagine a path forward in which we can look at how do we transition out of this and what are some of the constructive roles that faith communities can play. I say this as somebody who not only plays a public role as with a faith-based think tank, but I also serve as an elder and the chair of a council of a 500-member congregation. And let me say, first of all, that I have signed, I think, about 8 or 9 different letters. I have engaged in dozens of conversations with officials at provincial as well as municipal levels. And I want to say that my experience in terms of the responsiveness to the dialogue has been nothing but constructive. That doesn't mean we've always agreed, and that doesn't mean I've always got what I was looking for or hoping for, but I always left the meetings feeling at least we had the opportunity to put forward our point of view. And I know from colleagues in other jurisdictions, that's not always been their experience. So I want to just say thank you for your collective roles in that and for the opportunities. I know the Premier's had a call with various faith leaders as well, and your government certainly has sought to at least open doors of communication, even if the answers haven't always been there. But I want to think a little bit about where do we go from here, and how do we move forward. And one of the things, I made about a dozen phone calls in the last couple of days to leaders of different faith communities to try to make sure that I was understanding not just people from my own faith tradition, but other faith traditions and what they were experiencing. And the most common theme I heard was a disappointment that faith has not been understood as an essential service. We recognize that food in our bodies is essential, and at all stages of the pandemic, I could order my groceries online, yes, but I also could go to the grocery store with certain provisions and all the rest. And being fed spiritually is important to people. And while some things are being done online, there are some things that cannot. And I think especially, I was speaking with a priest yesterday in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, our friends in the Catholic tradition, where the Eucharist is central in all of this. But right across faith traditions, there's a real feeling of further efforts need to be made to highlight faith as an essential service. Forgetting how we got here, where can we go from here? What can faith leaders do? What can you do? What can we do together to move to a system where the focus is on the safe gathering of the faithful rather than arbitrary limits, including the number 10 that continues in gray zones?
Well, again, that's a great question, and why weren't the churches and the places of worship deemed essential services is a very good question. It was debated, and many of us believe that it should be an essential service. But like we did with many other issues, we needed to weigh the health and safety of the individuals in the province of Ontario and rely on our chief medical officers to provide us with the best evidence or the best guidance to ensure that we kept people safe. And that was the limitations that were placed on congregate gatherings. Now, from my standpoint, and I have been always the first one to advocate on behalf of the importance of our spiritual leaders in providing guidance to us as well, and getting it through this pandemic. And when we get to the other side, the individuals that are going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And by that, I mean that many people do not go see psychologists and psychiatrists. They don't necessarily need to go see them, but they do want to talk to their priest, to their rabbi, to their imam. They want to hear from them. They want to have those interactions. So, cautiously, as we move from one zone to the other, we're allowing more of those congregate type settings to take place. The vaccines are going to be a huge benefit to us in terms of restabilizing our communities, and again establishing those routines, which are also critical not only to our health, mental health as adults, but also to that of our children. So I think the role of the faith community, the role of our spiritual leaders, is going to be extremely important and critical. Again, I'm going to talk from personal experience. Being in Vaughan Woodbridge, we have quite a few funeral homes, and the funeral homes were filled, not having the ability to have the priest, do a proper service at the end, as a funeral, not having the opportunity to grieve, whether it be in a long-term care home or in the funeral home, when you have the possibility of bringing the family together. These were significant in my community. And, we're feeling the repercussions today, and we're going to continue feeling them, because I believe a lot of people have not grieved the death of their loved ones. We're still sitting in kind of like almost a vacuum where our emotions haven't really been able to come out because of our concerns still, and the fright that we have, the scare that we have with respect to the COVID-19 and potentially another wave. But we're going to be relying, or I know I will be relying on our faith leaders to continue to do the heavy lifting that they've done in the limited way they've been able to do it so far, to bring the people back in and to give them that nurturing that needs to be there. Because regardless of your faith, we know how important that is to who we are, the essence of who we are, our intrinsic value system.
One of the one of the things that has been highlighted in the feedback that I've got is that it's not only the worship services, and I think you just touched on that, Minister Thibodeau. A considerable amount of the work of faith leaders involves visiting parishioners, counseling them through trials, using the biblical expression of rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn. And that certainly is an important part, especially through major life transitions. You mentioned funerals, but there are also, weddings and life transitions that are happening along the way. Is there, and I'd invite any of you to jump in on this one, is there a way to consider for flexibility for religious leaders to be granted sort of a similar exemption as a medical leader or whatever, in terms of providing spiritual counsel and that, and perhaps creating, when we think of visiting limits and some of those things that are there, finding a way that spiritual counsel using safe methods, but it's happening in a lot of other spheres, and yet a lot of religious leaders are feeling constrained. They either are quietly breaking the law and going ahead and visiting anyway, which causes them crisis of conscience and challenges. Are there ways in terms of thinking of changing the exemption to highlight not just worship services and services that take place in a church, religious facility, but more broadly? Is that something that has been considered? Is that something that, how would we go about promoting that sort of broader exemption, recognizing the important role of spiritual services also in a counseling and a one-on-one environment?
Well, I'll start, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues. When the whole discussion started with places of worship, the way it started for me was that I started noticing an increase in the rates of relapse with people that were either alcoholic or were using substances. And when we started digging, we realized that many of the places of worship were also where people went for AA and NA. And all those meetings were canceled. So for me, it became a priority, and we started with roundtables around the province. I don't know how many I did, but I know that Sam did some. I know that Monty McNaughton, our Minister of Labor, did quite a few as well. It's important, I believe, it's important that we do something more from the standpoint of, getting us back to having situations where we can increase the numbers of people that can come together. Can we deem religious leaders essential service providers? Can we inoculate them with vaccines so that we reduce the risk of harm to them? And maybe these are things that we can definitely speak about, and there's enough of us in caucus and in cabinet that are very much interested and concerned in having the doors to the places of worship open to allow those congregate settings to take place. I mean, I come back to this not necessarily from a religious standpoint, but from the standpoint of spirituality. The fact that people want to be together, they want to console each other, they want to share moments of time of joy, whether it be through a sacrament or a religious service or just getting together. I mean, you derive so much. I just recently, after I don't know how many months of sitting in my 14 by 14 room office, I managed to go for dinner with 3 other people my age. And we sat and we had dinner. And in that conversation over 4 hours, I walked out of there and I felt uplifted. And I'm thinking to myself, this is what I've been missing in my life. So if I'm feeling this, I can only imagine how many more people are feeling it as well. So do we need to do more to engage with our places of worship, with our spiritual leaders? Absolutely. And as the Minister responsible for mental health and addiction, I can tell you how important it is and how I recognize this as something that needs to be done. But again, it comes back to weighing the potential risk. And I saw some of the comments, and I agree with some of those comments. I've been in churches where they wipe it down between services, maintain the social distance. They've done an extremely good job of ensuring that the environment that people are coming into is clean and as COVID-free as it could possibly be. And there haven't been outbreaks that I'm aware of through places of worship. So can we do more? I think the evidence supports that we should be. Can we convince the public health officers? I think we can, but I think it's also going to take your work, your advocacy, to make sure that it's coming from the other side as well, so that together we can come up with a strategy that's going to be safe, which is a primary concern to the Premier. You have to believe me, our Premier does not want things shut down. He wants to get back to an economy. He wants to get back to us being able to socialize again. But it weighs heavily on him when one person dies as a result of something that perhaps we should have done a little bit better. But I fully support doing more, but keeping in mind that we must keep the people of the province safe, and we must keep capacity open in our hospitals to ensure that anyone who needs help is able to get it. And I want to make that point very, very clearly. I had a meeting with the OMA and 6 palliative care doctors, and they all said the same thing to me. They were in the process of having to decide who gets treatment and who doesn't. And I defy anyone on this call to say to me that if you walked in with your mom or your dad, in my case, and my 82-year-old mother, and a doctor had to make a decision, does she get the support or does a 60-year-old get support? Because there just isn't the capacity to help both, just one. No doctor in this province wants to make that decision. And trust me, I don't want to make that decision either as a politician. So we've got to balance out what's in the best interests of all of us in the province.
I'm gonna transition to MPPs Osterhoff and Bauma to give you a chance to jump in. I've just been handed a question though that sort of fits as a supplementary, so let me throw that in, and then maybe we can deal with that at the same time. Actually, two: one from an Orthodox rabbi in Ottawa, and another from a law and public policy professor who has joined us as well. And both amount, I won't read their questions directly, but both amount to the same things and saying, we're hearing lots of numbers about case and ICU and all the rest, the very quantitative numbers that are there. But has the government given some more consideration to perhaps on an equally consistent basis, sharing other numbers that show other dimensions of this? There's a feeling that there's I'm interpreting these questions here, but I'm getting the sense underneath that there's an acceptance of the answer of the concerns about the healthcare system, but there's not a sense that even in the public dialogue by the numbers that are being released, there's equal weight given to the other dimensions that are there, and perhaps by sharing similar data on a more regular basis seems to be the suggestion of a way out. MPP Osterhoff, why don't you take a crack at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to share into the chat if I can. If you go to COVID-19 sciencetable.ca, that's the Ontario Science Advisory Group that advises the COVID-19 command table, and they have a number of briefs. And actually in some of that, they detail some of the other areas of concern around mental health and addictions, around other interactions. And of course, there's a lot being written about the economic impacts. There's a few different challenges. One, I think, so especially for myself as a Christian, recognizing that, there's not an inch of creation over which Christ does not say this is mine, to quote Kuiper. There's also a real consideration of the fact that I think we've created a form of dualism in our society that sees faith as very much just one segment of a life. And so that's one aspect. It's not banana bread. So when people think of faith, I'm talking about in the public sphere, in governments as well, faith is sort of seen as the chocolate chip on top of the rest of your life. It's a chocolate chip cookie and you sprinkle some chocolate chips on your oatmeal, but it's not seen as banana bread. And our faith, I believe, for most people is a banana bread, and that it impacts every aspect of their life in some way, shape, or form, and the decisions they make, and the way that they view the world, and how they think of themselves in relationship to others, and how they view their public participation. So that's the one challenge, is a bit of that dissonance between understanding faith communities not just as a subsegment of the population, but as really people who are trying to live out that faith in a very real way. So that's a concern. I think another concern is coming down, as you mentioned, to making sure that we don't have a reductionistic approach, and that we are recognizing those other impacts. And it is a real challenge. I don't claim to have the answer. And I guess the way I would push it back a little bit on people who are watching this is to think about consistories, or think about councils. And I'm sure there's a lot of very strong feelings within your church or synagogue or Gurdwara councils about these issues, but how do those strong feelings actually end up being implemented when the consistory walks out of that door? You might all, for example, just to give an example, you might all say we should all reopen our doors on Sunday, and individually you might think that that's what you want to do, or you should say close for years. And yet when you walk out of the door, because of your office as elder, you're balancing things. And that's a struggle the government has, as well as you're taking the advice of the medical officers, you're hearing from your constituents with regards to their concerns, you're following what you're hearing from the Ontario Medical Association, as well as what you're hearing from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. And so what I want to push back a little bit, I think, is this perception that the Premier has just is so gung-ho for lockdowns. And I don't think that's at all accurate. The Premier wants things to be able to be open, but he wants them to be able to be open safely. And he's not going to take actions that endanger both people's lives and the ability for people to be able to have a sustained recovery. So I do believe there's an exit strategy as well, as we see both the vaccination rolling out, the natural changes and evolution of the disease and broader herd immunity. But I do want to perhaps push back on that perception, because I know the Premier wants to see things reopened as soon as safely possible, as does our whole team. But we have to balance a lot of those pieces as well.
MPP Belma, anything to add on that?
Well, it's pretty tough to follow MPP Osterhoff. He's always very thorough and has his facts straight. But I would tend to agree. The fact of the matter is that those other issues are going into the decision-making process of cabinet and of the Premier, and but the reported facts remain just the hard facts that are on the ground. And then some consideration also has to be given to some of the data that is actually out there regarding some of these other things. I've had so many constituents calling me with the dramatic increase in suicides, and yet then we see articles in the CBC that actually do a deep dive into those numbers, and then the actual data doesn't bear out some of those claims. And so I think those are all factors that go into that also. But I will reiterate, and I had the opportunity to have a good conversation with the Premier yesterday morning, and I will say, rightly or wrongly, he carries the concerns of 14.5 million people around his shoulders, and he bears every failed business, he bears every death personally, which I've told him before he has no right to bear. That's too much for him. And he wants nothing more than to get through this and to be able to open everything up as quickly as possible. And he has a deep appreciation for the community. And I think he also really understands the need for us to be able to gather together in our days and to be able to worship as soon as possible. And yet, I will tell you that if he knew that one extra person caught COVID and died because of the decision to open things up too early, he would feel that very, very keenly. And that weighs extremely heavily on him. So I'll end with that.
Sam, you wanted back in quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. I wanted to, I completely agree with MPP Belma as well on that, because I've seen just this stress that the Premier has with these decisions and trying to follow the best advice possible and build consensus, right? Decision-making processes are based around consensus. And I know everyone has some doctors or someone who disagrees with the consensus from a YouTube clip or something, but that's not how you build public policy. You have to take all these pieces. But I wanted to engage because there's a number of different questions about the percentage pieces and the changing percentages. And I just want to let you know what I had as a response when I asked the question, why 25%, for example, in gray, but not for churches. And the response, you can argue with this response, but I'm just going to tell you what I was told by the team from the chief medical officer was essentially, so retail businesses, if you think about most retail in your area, you only have a few people, even at 25% capacity, you'll have like 5 or 6 or 7 people in most retail spaces, and they're not in close proximity to each other for an extended period of time. But in a church setting or in any place of worship, at 25% capacity, I mean, you do just have more people in a closer setting for a greater period of time in a higher risk context because of singing and other pieces. So you don't need to agree with it, but I'm just telling you, I've asked the question and that's the response.
Certainly. Let me, MPP Osterhoff, you managed to quote Kuiper and banana bread, which makes this a very Cardus sort of event. So let me use that to make a bit of a transition. Cardus has conducted extensive research on how people's love for God translates into love for neighbor. And if you go to haloproject.ca, you will find us in partnership with others applying recognized economic and research methods to establish the fact that every charitable dollar that's receipted to a faith institution translates into about $4.77 of public good. As I've had conversations over the last few months, especially with vaccine rollouts and news of all of this, on several occasions, faith leaders said, how can we help? We have infrastructure, we have church buildings, mosques, synagogues. There's we're close to a lot of communities. We have the ability to rally significant volunteer networks. What would you suggest, what would you recommend to faith leaders who want to be constructive and want to serve their neighbors in the midst of this and want to make available? It feels a little bit to a lot of faith leaders like they're busy doing their thing in their own echo chamber. Municipal leaders and civic leaders are doing their thing over here. And how do we facilitate the transition so that the assets, the banana bread of faith and feeding our neighbor, how do we improve on what we've been doing? Anyone? That was not meant to be a showstopper.
Yeah, so
go ahead, MP.
So I'll go if no one else is. I don't want to monopolize. I thought actually a lot about this because so many of the premises that we have put in place, restrictions, are based off of the government having to take that sector into account. So let me give you an example: healthcare, right? So we have a particular form of healthcare. I understand, of course, that the medicine that we have in place came about also as a result of a deeply religious man, Tommy Douglas, and came from a place of faith. I'm not arguing that point, but now we have a place where the state does run healthcare, and to a certain extent, faith communities have removed themselves or abdicated their own engagement in those places. Of course, you have Catholic hospitals and Jewish hospitals, and you have Christian long-term care homes, and you have different places that are involved, and you have the Red Cross and Red Crescent. But broadly speaking, a lot of those places of education, of healthcare, of social services have been de-religionized, not necessarily even by the state saying we want to take over these services, but often also by a withdrawal from those services by faith communities. And I think, if anything, we've seen that when the state's resources are stretched thin, as we have in the case of the pandemic across North America and across Europe, that creates a real need and an opportunity for faith communities to be involved, whether that's in long-term care, whether that's in providing things at the food bank, or being involved in these areas. And I think that's something where, for myself personally, as a Christian, I don't think myself and my congregation have always been as engaged in that area as we could have been. And this has been a bit of a wake-up call that I think can be echoed.
Minister Thibodeau, anything to?
Yeah, this is a really good question as well. I mean, I ran an organization that was started by a Catholic priest for 10 years. And I was extremely frustrated by the fact that we had to go out and beg, borrow not steal, but beg, borrow, but it came close a few times to steal as well, to keep the doors open to help the people in the province of Ontario with addiction issues. And one of the things that I'm often quoted saying is that many of the services that are being provided in the province of Ontario to people in need of help, and I'm not just talking about addictions or issues relating to mental health, but also with respect to neurodevelopmental disorders, are all organizations that were created at the grassroots level and organically grown. Now, what that means is that government's done very little. I'd almost say they've done nothing in the past to help organizations and help the people of the province. And I think it's been highlighted by the pandemic just how much heavy lifting is being done by organizations that raise money. And a lot of them are in the churches. A lot of them are people of faith that, strongly believe in helping their neighbor. And that's where many of the organizations started. And I challenge you to name an organization of the 600 that are doing most of the work in this province. And whether it's the RENA organization in the Jewish community, Meta in the Catholic community, and I could list probably 30 or 40 of them that I've been involved with helping fundraise for. It's time government does more. And I think we need to do more in the way of collaborating with the good work that our churches and our places of worship have done in establishing, yes, a fragmented system, but not by fault of the organizations that sprung up to help people, by the fact that there's never been anyone to coordinate and cause the collaboration to take place. So I'm very much supportive of continued these discussions long after COVID is said and gone, and utilize the networks to help reinforce what we're trying to build through the network or through the framework that we've established with the Roadmap to Wellness. There's a lot of work we can do together. And, I think also the other part that we need to remember, government can't do it alone. We have to rely on, people that have spent their lives studying society and studying and worshiping and trying to teach us how to be better Catholics, Christians, Jews, Muslims. We need to incorporate and bring that back in. And I'm a huge proponent and believer that it's not enough for us to be doing it. We have to be teaching our children to do that as well, because ultimately the people that are going to be taking care of us are Sam and his generation. So we want to make sure that the young people get it and they remember the importance and the value of old guys like me and others that did so much to pave the way for the younger generation. So there's a whole system here that we need to understand, and we need to work together to ensure that we build something that government and community faith-based leaders are working together to ensure that we build that system for everyone.
We have about 15 minutes left, and the questions are coming in fast and furious. So I'm fairly rapid fire going to give you what I've got here, and let's see how many of them we can get through wanting to honor. I have two similar questions here, one from a Roman Catholic leader in Toronto, another from a Reformed pastor in the Hamilton area. The one asks, is there specific science to support the number 10 in the gray zones? And the other is asking, the current cap of 30% in all the color zones except gray, nothing changes. Should there not be a progressive increasing of the cap towards 100% in the various zones? So they both seem to be tied to the numbers and the science behind the numbers, and whether or not we can look forward to perhaps a change in terms of transitioning beyond the 30%. Is there anyone who wants to jump at that one?
I'll take a stab at it, Ray, just on the piece of what next steps and what's appropriate. I have not seen any evidence stating that 10 is a good number, other than the fact, as Sam was alluding to, with small businesses being at 25%. If you have 10 people in the house of worship, hopefully they can stay well enough apart that that's not a problem. In talking to a lot of faith leaders, 30% is a pretty good capacity for most facilities if you're going to maintain social distancing. And I've had that conversation with a number of faith leaders, just, so what would be the next level? And, if we needed to maintain social distancing, what would be your building capacity? And I haven't seen any strong arguments to say that you can go to 50, 60, 70% and maintain some form of social distancing. So 30% was a conversation that that number was achieved at through consultation through faith leaders. And I don't know what that looks like moving forward. And I guess that is a great conversation that I would like to have with my two brothers on the phone is that are on today. You know, from 30%, where do we go? And at what point do we
Can
go
I,
there? And that is a great question.
if I can just respond from a conversation I had with a faith leader yesterday on this exact thing, and I'll just throw out the suggestion for that. And he was saying at a certain level, move beyond a fixed percentage, because there's such a range in the nature of physical buildings that indeed for many buildings, 30% is all that you could have with social distancing. There are some buildings, and he cited a couple in his religious tradition, I don't know those buildings, in which easily 50 or 60%, given the way the building is laid out in a very wide open space, and if people are in their budget bubbles. And his suggestion was, rather than government having a fixed number, as you move to the more progressive zones, moving to just the fact that as long as you, within your context of building, have the ability to socially distance and do it safely, and put trust back to the local leadership to carry that out. So I just throw that out as a concrete conversation I had yesterday. This from a Barry or Sam, you wanted?
Yeah, can I very quickly build off that? One of the problems in that, and I know there was initially like a conversation about a hard cap of 50 people, but you know, a little church out in the country, 50 people's too many practically, and then 50 people in most of, like my church fits 600, so 50 people is nothing in my church. And then that's also a recognition of that need, building off that. But one of the challenges is that the churches and the faith communities of all backgrounds are not united, right? So you have a lot of different perspectives even there. A colleague who I won't mention, I remember last summer when the cases were low, and I said, hearing a lot from the faith communities in my riding that they would love to see an increase, 50% or something. And I was just having the conversation, and this colleague responded, he said, no, we can't open the churches. That's where all the seniors are. They're the most vulnerable. No. And this was really interesting because it was very illuminating that that was the perspective of this particular colleague on places of worship as the places where the seniors go and they're vulnerable, so we can't reopen them. I wouldn't agree with that depiction, but it is a challenge when churches in his particular area or other places of worship hadn't been bringing forward that concern.
We haven't touched on this theme yet. Barry Pastor has written, when and how can singing be resumed? The importance of singing has not been revisited. Initial studies banning singing were dated. Singing with mass is an issue that should be addressed again. Any feedback on that?
Here.
Oh, go ahead, Will. Sorry.
No, I don't have a great voice, but I have a loud voice, and I feel worship includes singing. Although my friend that works for me worships in a church where the congregation does no singing whatsoever. But that is a conversation that I would love to have, and it is very, very important to me. I'll leave it there.
And I have to agree with that. There's nothing makes you feel better than expressing your thoughts or your feelings with song. And again, if we can get to the point where we can have the herd immunity, or we can have the physical distancing and get to the point where we can do that, that would obviously for me be a very important thing to see again. I mean, to not be able to hear spiritual music is just disheartening for many people. And you leave happier when you hear songs. So yes, definitely something we need to revisit, and it's something that I'm sure that my colleagues and myself will bring forward, whether it be in caucus or in cabinet. It's something that we will be discussing. But again, I have to, and I want to say this clearly to all of you. This is great. I'm glad that there's as many people on this call. We need to continue the advocacy. We need to continue to keep this front and center as an issue, so that it forces us to look at this and to challenge some of the things that are being brought forward by our chief medical officers. We're always going to follow them, but at the same time, they'll listen to reason as well, and we'll try to figure out a way to keep the balance there and keep people safe, but at the same time, give us back some of those freedoms that are so important to our spirituality.
That transitions. I've just been handed two questions that are quite similar. One from a police officer in Ontario, And I chuckle a little bit in the sense that the Premier is not on this call, and he is probably the only one who can answer this question. So I understand in advance. It says, will your government consider an associate minister dedicated to religious and faith groups in this province? Thank you for your consideration. And that ties into what a Seventh-day Adventist pastor from Grimsby says. Is there any way to place a higher priority on the importance of faith communities in Ontario? Is there someone in government advocating on their behalf? Now, I happen to know from private conversations that not only you on this call have been certainly listening to and carrying forth the voice of faith groups in caucus, but so have a good number of your colleagues as well, although any caucus represents the cross-section of Ontario. And, you know, we also need to be cognizant, while, you know, roughly 3 out of 4 Canadians have some adherence or identification with faith, there's only 11% of us that attend on a weekly basis. So there's quite a range in terms of spirituality along the way. Let me transition to this. It took COVID, and I'm pointing when I point a finger here, there are 4 pointing back at me. So this is not meant in an accusatory way. It took COVID for us to arrange this sort of a consultation between faith leaders in Ontario and representatives of this government on this particular thing. As we think of the lessons of COVID, is one of the consequences going to be increased collaboration between faith leaders and civic leaders? And if so, what are the concrete steps that you need to take, and what are the concrete steps that you would say to the over 150 faith leaders from a wide variety of faiths that are listening to you at this time?
If I can just say one quick, and I'm going to answer this question from my perspective and from my experience. When I started working with people that had addictions, one of the things that, of course, I fell back on was the fact that I'm Roman Catholic, and that I believe in God, and that there's a lot of good that comes from putting your life and your faith, your direction in life in the hands of your Creator. But I also found that many people were resistant of the fact that we were reducing it down to religion. Well, I'm not Catholic. Why should I listen to you? And we all know that there are many principles that form the basis of our intrinsic motivation, who we are, fundamental values that, regardless of your faith, are central to being a good person, whether it be respect, whether it be respect for seniority, respect for each other, all the cardinal rules that we learn, regardless of the faith you come from. So what I did was I stopped talking about it in the term of being Roman Catholic or of religion, and I started talking it in terms of spirituality and the importance of spirituality in one's life, regardless of where that individual was coming from. And when I transitioned it into those types of communications, it seemed that everyone was much more accepting to the things that I had to say. That, and I'm not saying that we need to go to that extent when it comes to talking to government, but I think from the standpoint of advocacy, and not that I'm looking for more responsibility, but to me, spirituality is a component of mental health. To me, I think it's extremely important that this dialogue continues, whether it be with me as the minister or someone that follows me in this in the capacity of being the minister, because I have a unique position to other ministers. I'm in the face of 16 ministers who all have something to do with mental health. So I can bring the aspects of spirituality to the discussion at the cabinet table. I can bring that forward, again, whether it be me or someone taking my place as the Associate Minister for Mental Health and Addictions, but it gives us that opportunity. So I think this dialogue is extremely important. Yes, COVID brought it forward as a way for us to reach deeper and understand a little bit more what we need to do. So I invite the communication to continue. I'm very interested in continuing. I know Sam is, and Will is as well. And there are others in our caucus that are also very interested in continuing that conversation. So we're here and we're going to listen.
We're almost running out of time, and I'm going to give you each a chance to sort of have a closing chance to say anything you haven't had a chance to say before we go. Let me just pick up on that though, Minister, and say, you know, for Cardus as a faith-based think tank, one of the things that we highlight is something we call faithful presence. And that is the fact that people of faith are not just people of faith when they are attending their worship institutions. They are people of faith in their businesses and in their communities and need to express. So in many ways, you know, even the premise of that question, that the only way that faith and government have dialogue is that when faith leaders and civic leaders are having official institution to institution conversations, that's the only place that happens, I think is a mistaken presumption. It's much broader than that. That said, especially given, and you know, I don't have time and I won't read, I have a couple of questions here that deal with government's trust in faith institutions and whether or not, you know, the tone of some of these questions are, can't you just give us more space to manage affairs within? I do think there is a place for faith institutions as institutions and government as an institution to have dialogue as well. And certainly would look forward to ways of exploring. I think that's an important part that's probably missing in the mainstream civic conversation. There's just a couple of minutes left. I want to give each of you a minute or so to just say anything that you want to say to those who are here that you may not have had a chance. MPP Balma, can we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Ray. I'll begin by saying thank you for everyone for being on the call, for being here listening. And I also want to say for making this opportunity happen. The work that you do in keeping faith relevant in our society, very much appreciated. We seem to be in time, and it's been alluded to earlier that it is not acceptable to have faith centrally in our public life. And yet here in my riding of Brantford and Brant, Six Nations, I have a community that's very much allowed and encouraged. And I point to the community of Six Nations where their spirituality is very much a part of their public life also and how they do things. And I think we can have that conversation and we can get back to a point where it is okay to be a person of faith, to be a person of a religion, and to have that religion impact your public life, not just something that happens in private. And I think we have the opportunity through COVID as faith leaders to really show what we can bring to the table, and especially working through the Minister of Mental Health. And I guess my comment back to Michael is, who is your parliamentary assistant for spirituality, faith, and I think that's a good idea to bring to the table. But thank you everyone for being here, and have a great afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. MPP Osterhoff.
Yeah, thank you. I would just ask for patience, but also for continued advocacy. I always say it doesn't do a lot of good if I stand and speak in caucus and say things as Sam, but if I can speak in caucus and share what my constituents are sharing, share what people either of faith backgrounds or other backgrounds are sharing about concerns, whether for more restrictions or for less restrictions, with concerns about the numbers or concerns about impacts of those numbers. All of those things help me advocate. I can't advocate without hearing from you. So please continue to ask these questions. I know all three of us regularly raise these questions in caucus, within cabinet, with the COVID command table as well. And sometimes, of course, those answers are responses, not necessarily answers, but we do our best to get answers where we can. And I would just ask for your continued prayers. There's a lot of fatigue, a lot of COVID fatigue, a lot of pressure both on medical officers who are ultimately humans as well. And we're all sinful humans, on us as politicians and on every level of government. So please pray for wisdom, discernment, and insight into the best path forward on this.
And the last word to you, Minister Tippolo.
Thank you, Ray. And I want to echo what both Will and Sam have said. And please do pray for us, because it does weigh heavily on all of us. We don't go to sleep at night thinking and making decisions lightly, and don't think about the consequences, not only of the decisions, but those that die as a result of perhaps not making the right decision. But I also want to say something to all of you here. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for being part of the unsung heroes that are making a difference in the lives of so many people. we don't always say thank you. We talk about the nurses. We've talked about, the people that are providing us with, our food supply, the food chain workers. We processing, but we don't say thank you to our spiritual leaders. And if it wasn't for a couple of really good friends that I have that are priests, I don't know what I do, because I still have the opportunity to speak over the phone. I know the difference they're making in people's lives by, driving through a senior's residence and blessing the seniors that are standing in the window looking. I know the difference that you are all making in the lives of the people that you look after. And I want to say thank you and God bless you for the work that you do. It is recognized. The guys on this call with me, the guys, my colleagues, my brothers, they know it, they get it. And we do advocate keeping in mind that every decision we make makes a difference in someone's life. And we truly value the work that you do in your communities to help us in these difficult times. We can't do it by ourselves. And I know that you must all be exhausted as well. So, I don't know who you turn to for help. There is a website. There are, internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy programs, first responder programs. If there's anything there that can help you, if there's anything we can do more to develop supports for you, because I don't know where you go for help, please let us know. We're in this together, and we haven't forgotten about you, and we truly appreciate your work. So thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of you. When we were setting this up, I promised you that I would attempt to be fair, respectful, and civil, but I also would try to put the questions as honestly as I could on behalf of the faith community so that we could have an honest forum of discussion. I hope that we have achieved that. I want to thank you. I want to thank Dr. Janet Epp Buckingham, director of our board, for introducing this panel. Cardus too relies on volunteers to keep the machinery of our organization going, as we seek also to look through the lens of faith and see the impact on all areas of life. To all of you who have registered, you can expect, I believe it is Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, so it probably will be Monday, but you can expect a follow-up email that will also provide links to this and opportunities for follow-up conversation. I indeed hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and pray indeed that God will bless us, you as elected officials, all of us, those on the call as faith leaders, and indeed us as a country as we go forward also through this challenge. God bless you all. Good afternoon.